The gravel crunched beneath Jack's worn hiking boots as he trudged up the overgrown path. Late autumn leaves, a mix of gold, crimson, and brown, whispered in the crisp wind. A single duffel bag hung over his shoulder, its weight dragging at his resolve. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of branches and the distant cry of a bird. He had driven hours to get here, to escape the endless pressure of his life, and find solace in the solitude of a cabin he hadn't visited in years. The cabin came into view as he crested a small hill. It was modest, barely large enough for two people, with a weathered wooden exterior and a small porch. He remembered summers spent here as a child with his parents, fishing in the nearby creek and roasting marshmallows by the fire. Those memories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Jack sighed and dropped his bag on the porch. He fumbled for the key in his pocket and unlocked the door. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the kind of smell that welcomed him like an old friend. The fireplace sat cold and unused, the furniture covered with white sheets. He pulled them off, sending a puff of dust into the air. The cabin was his retreat, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, or so he thought. As he turned to open the windows, a sound startled him. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. Footsteps crunching through leaves. Jack froze, his heart pounding. The cabin was miles from the nearest town. Who could be out here? The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Before Jack could react, there was a tentative knock. He hesitated, then approached the door and opened it slightly. On the porch stood a figure bundled in a thick coat, their face obscured by a scarf and a woolen hat. Despite the cold, their blue eyes sparkled with warmth. "Hi," the stranger said, their voice soft but confident. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I think I'm lost." Jack opened the door wider. The stranger was smaller than him, maybe in their late 20s, with delicate features partially hidden by the scarf. "Lost?" Jack asked, his voice gruff from disuse. "How'd you end up out here?" "I was hiking," they explained, "but I must have taken a wrong turn. My phone died, and I've been wandering for hours. I saw the light from your cabin and hoped someone might be here." Jack frowned. It was unusual to see anyone this deep in the woods, but the stranger's story seemed plausible. The sun was already setting, and the temperature would drop fast once it was dark. "You should come in," Jack said, stepping aside. "It's too cold to stay out there." The stranger hesitated, then nodded and stepped inside, removing their scarf and hat. As they did, Jack got a better look at them. Their soft, chestnut brown hair framed a face that was almost unnaturally smooth and feminine. They looked slightly out of place, as though they belonged in a city cafe rather than the wilderness. "Thank you," the stranger said, their voice carrying a hint of relief. "I'm Riley, by the way." "Jack," he replied, extending a hand. Riley shook it, their grip firm but not overly strong. Jack gestured to the small living room. "You can sit down. I'll get a fire going." As Jack worked on the fireplace, he stole glances at Riley. There was something enigmatic about them, something that didn't quite add up. Their clothes were practical, but their demeanor was polished, almost refined. Riley, for their part, seemed content to sit quietly, their eyes wandering around the cabin. "Do you live here?" Riley asked after a while. "No," Jack replied, feeding another log into the fire. "It's my family's place. I come here to get away." Riley nodded, their expression thoughtful. "It's nice. Peaceful." The fire crackled to life, filling the cabin with warmth. Jack stood and dusted off his hands. "You hungry?" "I was about to make something." "Only if it's not too much trouble," Riley said with a small smile. Jack moved to the tiny kitchen and started rummaging through his supplies. As he cooked, they talked, mostly small talk about the woods, hiking, and the weather. Riley was charming, their laughter light and infectious. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were holding something back, as though there was a wall between them. After dinner, they sat by the fire, sipping mugs of tea. The conversation grew more personal, though Riley remained guarded about certain details. "So," Jack said, leaning back in his chair, "what brings you out here? You don't strike me as the roughing it type." Riley chuckled. What gave me away? Jack smirked. You just seem polished. Like you belong in a city. Riley's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before they recovered. Maybe I do. But sometimes you need to get away, right? Jack nodded, sensing a deeper truth in their words. He didn't press further, but his curiosity grew. There was something about Riley that didn't quite fit, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong spot. As the evening wore on, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of their conversation began to erode Jack's wariness. Riley was easy to talk to, and their presence felt strangely familiar, as though they'd known each other longer than a few hours. When it grew late, Jack offered Riley the couch. It's not much, but it's better than the floor. Thanks, Riley said, their gratitude genuine. I owe you. Don't mention it, Jack replied, heading to the small bedroom. Good night. Good night, Riley said softly. The next morning, Jack woke early and stepped outside to gather firewood. The air was crisp and still, the sky a pale blue. As he worked, he couldn't stop thinking about Riley. There was a mystery about them that he couldn't ignore. When he returned to the cabin, Riley was sitting at the table, sipping a cup of tea. They looked up and smiled. Morning. Morning, Jack replied, setting the wood by the fireplace. Sleep okay? Better than I expected, Riley said. Thanks again for letting me stay. Jack nodded, studying them. He wanted to ask more about their story, but he didn't want to seem intrusive. Instead, he said, if you need help finding your way back, I can take you to the main trail. Riley hesitated, their fingers tightening around the mug. Actually, I was wondering if I could stay a little longer. Just for the day. Jack raised an eyebrow. What for? Riley looked away, their expression conflicted. I need some time. Away from everything. Jack considered this. There was no harm in letting them stay, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Riley was running from something. Still, he nodded. All right, but you'll have to help out. I'm not running a hotel. Riley smiled, their relief evident. Deal. As the day wore on, they settled into an easy routine. Riley helped Jack chop firewood and prepare meals, their laughter and banter filling the cabin. For a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. But as evening fell, Jack noticed something strange. Riley had gone to the bedroom to change into warmer clothes, and when they returned, their appearance was subtly different. Their features seemed softer, their posture more relaxed. It was as though they had shed a layer of armor. Jack didn't comment, but his curiosity burned. Later, as they sat by the fire, he finally asked, Riley, can I ask you something? Riley tensed, their eyes meeting his. Sure. What's your story? I mean, really? You don't seem like someone who just got lost on a hike. Riley hesitated, their gaze dropping to the floor. The silence stretched, the crackling fire the only sound. Finally, they spoke, their voice barely above a whisper. You're right. I wasn't hiking. I came here to get away from myself. Jack frowned. What do you mean? Riley looked up, their eyes filled with a vulnerability that took Jack by surprise. I'm not who you think I am. I'm transgender. The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Jack stared at them, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this, but suddenly, everything about Riley made sense. Their polished demeanor, their guarded answers, the subtle shifts in their appearance. I didn't mean to deceive you, Riley said, their voice trembling. I didn't know how to tell you. Jack took a deep breath, his initial surprise giving way to understanding. You didn't have to tell me, he said gently. But I'm glad you did. Riley looked at him, their eyes shining with unshed tears. You're not upset? Jack shook his head. Why would I be? You're still the same person I've been talking to all day. Riley smiled, a weight lifting from their shoulders. For the first time since they'd met, they seemed truly at ease. As the night wore on, their conversation deepened. Riley shared their struggles, their fears, and their hopes. Jack listened, his respect for them growing with every word. By the time the fire burned low, they both felt a bond that went beyond the circumstances of their meeting. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the woods, they found something unexpected. Connection. The next few days unfolded like a dream, unexpected, yet strangely comforting. Jack found himself surprised by how easily he adjusted to Riley's presence. They had fallen into a rhythm, working together on small chores around the cabin, talking about everything and nothing, and each evening, they'd find themselves by the fire, drawn to each other's company in the cozy warmth. Riley was opening up, slowly revealing more pieces of their life. They shared stories of growing up, their dreams, and the challenges they faced, especially the difficulties of being true to themselves in a world that didn't always understand. Jack listened, absorbing each word with quiet respect. Though he'd led a very different life, he found himself relating to Riley's journey, to the longing to escape and discover who he really was, apart from the expectations of others. One evening, as they watched the embers glow, Riley turned to him, an almost mischievous glint in their eye. "You know, Jack, I don't think you've shared much about yourself." Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised. "I haven't." "No," Riley replied with a smile. "You're always asking questions about me. It's only fair I get to ask some back." Jack chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fair enough. What do you want to know?" "Everything," Riley said, leaning back. "Start with the basics. Who is Jack, really?" Jack thought about that for a moment, letting the words come naturally. "Well, I grew up not too far from here, just in a small town. I was always outside, roaming the woods or working odd jobs to help my family. My parents taught me to work hard and keep to myself." He paused, a faraway look in his eyes. "After high school, I took a job in construction. The money was good, but it never really felt like it was what I wanted to do." "Why didn't you change paths?" Riley asked, her voice soft, curious. Jack shrugged. "I guess it just didn't seem possible. I had responsibilities. My folks needed the help, and I felt like I owed it to them." He glanced at her, offering a small, self-conscious smile. "I don't really talk about this much." Riley nodded understandingly. "I get it. Sometimes, we get so caught up in what we think we should do that we forget what we actually want." She hesitated, then added, "So, what do you want, Jack?" Jack looked away, feeling a bit exposed under Riley's gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's part of why I came here. To figure that out." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, a gentle reminder of the vast, empty woods surrounding them. "Thank you for trusting me," Riley said, breaking the silence. Jack looked at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. He nodded, a sense of warmth spreading through him. "Thank you for trusting me, too." They stayed like that for a while, wrapped in a comfortable silence, both of them feeling a sense of closeness that defied explanation. Jack had never felt this way before, this sense of connection that went beyond words. He was drawn to Riley, not just as a friend, but as someone who understood him on a level he hadn't known was possible. As the days passed, Jack found himself looking forward to each morning, to the simple pleasure of sharing coffee with Riley on the porch, to the quiet companionship they shared as they worked side by side. And in some unspoken way, Riley seemed to feel the same. One morning, after a heavy rain had left the woods glistening, Jack suggested they go for a hike. "There's a spot I used to go to as a kid," he said, an eager spark in his eyes. "The view's amazing. Want to check it out?" Riley grinned. "Lead the way." They set off together, the crisp air filling their lungs as they climbed the narrow path. Jack led the way, glancing back now and then to make sure Riley was keeping up. She had tied her hair back, her cheeks flushed with the exertion, and there was a joy in her expression that made Jack's heart beat faster. When they finally reached the clearing, they were both breathless, but the view was worth it. The landscape stretched out before them, a tapestry of autumn colors that seemed to go on forever. The sky was a clear, endless blue, and the sun cast a golden light over everything. "It's beautiful," Riley murmured, her voice filled with awe. Jack smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "I used to come here when I needed to think. It always helped me put things in perspective." They stood side by side, gazing out over the landscape, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Jack felt an urge to reach out, to take Riley's hand, but he hesitated, unsure if it would be welcome. Riley seemed to sense his hesitation and turned to him, her eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you for bringing me here, Jack. I haven't felt this free in a long time." Jack met her gaze, his heart pounding. "I'm glad," he said softly. "You deserve to feel free." They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, they moved closer, their faces mere inches apart. Jack's breath caught, and for a moment, he thought he might kiss her. But Riley looked away, her expression conflicted. "Jack, It's okay," Jack said quickly, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable." Riley shook her head, a soft smile on her lips. "You didn't. It's just complicated." Jack nodded, understanding. He didn't want to push her, didn't want to ruin the fragile connection they had built. But he couldn't deny the feelings that had begun to grow inside him, feelings that went beyond friendship. They made their way back to the cabin in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But despite the unspoken tension, there was a sense of understanding between them, a silent agreement to take things one day at a time. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Riley spoke up, her voice hesitant. "Jack, there's something I've been wanting to tell you. Something I need you to know." Jack looked at her, his expression serious. "What is it?" Riley took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I came here because I needed to get away from my life. To be myself, without fear or judgment." She glanced at him, her eyes filled with vulnerability. "I know I already told you that I'm transgender, but there's more to it than that." Jack listened, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew she needed to say this on her own terms. "I've spent so much of my life hiding," Riley continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hiding from my family, from society, and even from myself. I came here to find the courage to finally be who I am, without apology." Jack nodded, his respect for her growing. "You don't have to apologize for who you are, Riley. Not to me, not to anyone." Riley looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jack. I didn't expect to find someone like you out here, someone who would accept me for who I am." They shared a long, meaningful look, and for the first time, Jack felt a sense of clarity. He knew now that his feelings for Riley were real, that they went beyond friendship, beyond the circumstances of their meeting. He was drawn to her, not just for who she was, but for the strength and resilience she carried within her. As the night wore on, they continued to talk, sharing their hopes, their fears, and their dreams. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, they both felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging that they hadn't known before. The next morning, as they prepared to leave the cabin, Jack felt a pang of sadness. He knew that their time together was coming to an end, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Riley seemed to sense his thoughts and placed a hand on his arm, offering him a reassuring smile. "I'm glad I met you, Jack. You've given me something I didn't even know I needed." Jack smiled, his heart full. "You've done the same for me, Riley." They stood there, the forest quiet around them, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. And in that moment, they knew that no matter where life took them, they would always carry a part of each other with them, a connection that went beyond words. As they parted ways, Jack watched her disappear into the woods, his heart filled with a bittersweet ache. He knew that he would miss her, but he also knew that they had both found something precious in those few days, a sense of acceptance, of belonging, and of love. And as he turned back toward the cabin, he felt a quiet strength within him, a newfound sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was finally on the path to discovering who he truly was. Thank you so much for watching till now. It means the world to have you here. This community is all about empowering each other and celebrating the incredible journeys of everyone on their path to living authentically. If you're ever feeling lost or alone, remember you have a whole family here for you. Hit that subscribe button, smash that like button, and let's keep inspiring each other, sending you all the love and strength in the world. Until next time, live your life by your rules.